Welcome back to For All Kerbalkind. Man, do I miss saying that. Episode 13 was almost 7 months ago, and where we left off, both Beardy and I were right about to send crews to lunar orbit, so kind of a cliffhanger there. But before we get to what we're building and researching, the last thing we did in the previous episode was send a Wanderer, a small rover, to the moon to complete its contract, and thanks to the Bon Voyage mod, it is able to traverse the surface in the background, and will arrive quickly with no complications, so we hope, and no holding down W for hours on end. So let's check up with our little rover. June 8th, 1963. After spending some time to check systems, observe its terrain, and wait for its non-robotic masters to decide where next to roam, Wanderer makes its way across the various lunar hills and valleys of the lunar midlands towards 3 specific points marked by scientists on Earth, though it is only one stop on its foreseeably long journey across the lunar surface. Points Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie are explored with ease, fulfilling a contract for NASA. Now, as the Astral Foundation regains full control of its rover once again, Wanderer is sent to wander off. First to the lowlands southeast of its current location, and aiming to travel further and further east across as far of the near side as it is able. Its one drawback, however, its one limitation, is power. During the night, the small spacecraft must power down most of its systems, including communications, equipment, and motor function, awaiting sunlight once again to power them up. Although this significantly slows its ability to wander and collect science, it does guarantee, at least until solar panel degradation becomes more of a problem later on, a theoretical active lifespan of several years. We'll of course have to find out later on how far we'll actually get. These notes particularly pertain to upgrading our lunar landing technology. Lunar Exploration Blue Sky node, more lunar-rated comms for the Apollo high-gain antenna, which we may or may not have for the first landing attempt, not sure yet, and lastly 1968 Hydrolox engines for the upgraded J2 engine will need to upgrade the Cattern line of rockets later on. August 6th, 1963. News from the Soviet Union suggests a multi-launch operation to send cosmonauts into orbit of the moon has concluded successfully. After careful study of the various decrypted messages, mission photographs, and Soviet reports, we have no reason to believe this feat was falsified. Once ahead of the competition, so it seemed, the United States has once again been leapfrogged in firsts. Although, having flown past the moon with Gemini 3 in November of last year, it's hardly a blow to morale. More so, evidence that the Soviets are, at the very least, on par, if not well ahead, of our current capabilities in space. Concerns aside, a similar mission of our own is already well underway. This news simply prompts us to double our efforts in making sure we pull it off safely. August 19th, 1963. Michael and Scott, a new scientist recently added to the roster, sit aboard Gemini 5, running through checklists and monitoring systems as the clock continues counting down. Anticipation among bystanders and mission control rising. Today, we intend to combine the efforts of both Gemini 4's rendezvous and docking with Gemini 3's circumlunar flight, but we'll need 2 vehicles to pull it off. Behind Gemini 5 sits a peculiar Cattern 1, twin large UA-1204 rocket boosters attached to either side. It will be carrying the necessary Kentaur orbital rocket stage to bring crewed lunar orbit within our grasp. Midday, the clock reaches 0, the immediate lunar launch window is open, and Gemini 5 lifts off from Texas. In order to meet mission requirements with limited launch infrastructure, Gemini 5 had to abide by a maximum launch mass of 150 tons. To achieve this, weight reduction in several areas was required. Firstly, the Chiton II launch vehicle had to be underfueled. This required additional weight reduction of the Gemini spacecraft itself in order to still reach orbit with less fuel. Communication equipment was stripped down to the bare necessities. EVA tether equipment completely removed, the 4 Star Gemini retro rockets were also removed, and the reentry thruster pack was given 25% less fuel. And even with nominal Chiton II performance, utilizing slightly uprated engines borrowed from the Chiton III production line, Gemini is left just shy of orbital velocity. Chiton has successfully given the crew 14 minutes to prepare their spacecraft for orbital insertion, where the final vehicle modification is evident. 2 additional OMS thrusters have been added to the equipment module to accommodate for the necessary orbital insertion burn, doubling the thrust and therefore halving the time needed to perform the orbital insertion maneuver, and giving the mission a better chance of success. With a perfect performance of the launch vehicle, turns out this actually wasn't entirely necessary, but better safe than sorry. Above the Atlantic Ocean, Gemini 5 performs their circularization burn, bringing their orbit to 345 by 200 kilometers. The high apogee was also planned to accommodate the insertion burn as well, which turned out to also be overkill, but all things nominal, the crew are in orbit and are ready for their ride to arrive next. Back down on the ground, being monitored overnight, Caterin 1 is pressurized, fueled, and ready to go. The crew of Gemini 5 have decided to name the Kentaur transfer stage they will be using to fly to and from the moon Fortune, as a token of good luck. The seemingly experimental nature of the 1204 boosters attached to Caterin 1 are necessary to lift the entire Kentaur into Earth orbit, as every drop of fuel counts. Although to accommodate for current launch infrastructure, the 1204s are not fully packed with solid fuel. They are underfueled just as Gemini 5's Chiton II was, in order to not exceed a launch pad limit of 700 tons. Above, in orbit, the crew of Gemini 5 observed the sunrise over the Pacific Ocean, as Fortune lifts off of the pad to meet them. Blasting through max Q at unprecedented speeds, the 1204 boosters are jettisoned successfully, burning out the remainder of their fuel as they tumble through the atmosphere. Fortune is well on its way by now. The explosive separation of Stage 1 and 2 never gets old. This time we are able to showcase a new addition to the Kentaur stages, insulation panels protecting the stage from boil-off on the launch pad and during ascent. They are jettisoned along with the first stage as they are no longer necessary. Caterin 1's second stage cuts off with 25 meters per second of fuel remaining. Fortune is now in orbit of the Earth, ahead of Gemini 5 in its orbit, but with an apogee of 410 kilometers. The distance between the two spacecraft will be reduced with every orbit until rendezvous. 12 hours from liftoff, Fortune pulses its engines and fine-tunes its orbital encounter with Gemini 5. The two spacecraft will rendezvous in a little over an hour. Michael and Scott are prepped with Fortune's telemetry that it will require one more burn to perform as it approaches, burning off all of its relative velocity, nearly 200 meters per second, safely within a 1 kilometer distance of their spacecraft. Approaching from above, Fortune lights its engines for 24 seconds, all but nullifying its relative velocity to Gemini. The burn is more than anticipated before, but Fortune's remaining fuel should be adequate to handle the rest of the mission regardless. Michael pilots his craft using a series of maneuvers to get closer to Fortune over the next few minutes. The recent sunrise provides excellent visibility of Fortune, as well as maximum leniency regarding time to dock during sunlight. Though, with the expert Kerbonauts filling the Foundation's ranks, this feat is made smoothly and swiftly. Approaching their orbital taxi, if it were, Weigl performs station keeping for a few moments as the Kentaur stage slowly orients itself to the Earth-based preferred docking attitude. Observing this maneuver complete, Gemini 5 slowly approaches for initial docking. Now docked, Gemini 5 will remain in this configuration for the majority of its flight. Fortune is their ride to the moon and their ride back. They will be able to return home in the event of a mission-preventing failure during many portions of their mission, apart from reaching and leaving lunar orbit. Understanding the risks, Weigl and Scott are briefed on the coming translunar injection on the next revolution. Ideally, the crew would be brought to a free return trajectory, allowing the vehicle to return to the Earth in the event of a failure en route to the moon up to lunar capture. However, Gemini 5 will instead burn directly to lunar orbit. Although more dangerous, this is necessary to save Unfortune's fuel, as boil-off may eventually prove more substantial than expected. Lose enough fuel and we're stranded in lunar orbit anyway, making a free return trajectory unnecessary in certain aspects. When the time comes, Fortune lights its engines for over 5 minutes, until it reaches the speed necessary to reach the moon. Burning successfully, and after using the ohms on Gemini for a small course correction in the opposite direction, the remaining fuel of the Kentaur is monitored closely, and Gemini enters a slow rotation for its week-long journey to the moon. Ideally, this journey wouldn't take longer than 3 days, but the additional time to reach their target shouldn't lead to any further problems and actually saves a little bit of fuel. Weigl and Scott get comfortable in their two-seater. It's gonna be a long road trip. Seven days pass, a normal August week for those back home, but for Foundation faculty and crew, the week moves both excruciatingly slow, yet surprisingly quick. Portholes included in Gemini's design allows Scott to photograph the Earth as it gets further and further away. Same for the moon as it gets closer and closer. Unlike Gemini 3, the crew has not experienced any solar storms. In fact, the trip has been quite uneventful for all involved. Systems being monitored, periodic medical self-examinations, adapting to the space environment in their confined environment, sleeping, eating, conversing with ground control themselves, performing various mini-experiments, the list goes on. But as the moon comes into view, the crew of two approach a vital part of their flight: lunar insertion burn. It takes less than a minute, a nail-biting short moment, and then cut off. They've done it. Weigl and Scott will spend the next 20 or so hours in a 287 by 96 kilometer orbit of the moon, photographing geographical features, craters, mountains, ridges, flats, anything and everything Scott's scientist eyes draw attention to. Of course, it's the sightseeing trip of a lifetime, but more so, the crew of Gemini 5 find themselves in an unprecedented situation, which allows them to research and observe possible future landing locations. The Trinity program is right around the corner, and with the daring goal of stepping foot on its surface, for now this is as close as anyone on Earth is able to get. For just less than a day, the crew is too excited to sleep. The Earthrise is beautiful, the passing alien landscape enthralling. All else fades away. There is only Kerbalkind and all of the cosmos. And how horrifyingly wonderful that is. How much more there must be to explore. How many more moons or planets will we be able to discover, to photograph, to step foot on? You can't help but dream being all the way up there. It's just our nature. The best 20 hours of Michael and Scott's lives pass far too quickly, and the MET is counting up towards a planned burn to come back home. Fortune just has one more burn to perform, and despite the wonder around them, the crew are well aware of the possibility of failure at this point in time. If Fortune fails, there is no coming home. 40 seconds later, and Fortune has sent Gemini 5 on its way back home. The crew wave farewell and undock from the Kentaur stage shortly afterwards. Its destiny will be to burn up in Earth's atmosphere. Michael and Scott, however, now have the freedom of attitude control and visibility through the front-facing windows. So, as they rapidly ascend from lunar space, they take one last opportunity to photograph various craters, landmarks, and Fortune as the two craft drift further and further apart. In less than 4 days, Michael and Scott will be back on the ground, and no other Gemini will be sent to the moon again, as the next crewed lunar missions will have to wait for Trinity.
The moon is essentially gray. No color. Looks like plaster of Paris. Or sort of a grayish beach sand. We can see quite a bit of detail. The Sea of Fertility doesn't stand out as well here as it does back on Earth. There's not as much contrast between that and the surrounding craters. The craters are all rounded off. There's quite a few of them. Some of them are newer. Many of them look like, especially the round ones, look like hit by meteorites or projectiles of some sort. Langrenus is quite a huge crater. It's got a central cone to it. The walls of the crater are terraced, about 6 or 7 different terraces on the way down. And coming up now to the Sea of Fertility are the old friends Messier and Pickering that I liked about so much on Earth. We're coming up now near our B1 initial site, which I'm going to try and see. Be advised, the round window, the hatch window, is completely iced over. We can't use it. No light is shining around in the window. Pickering are quite faint from here. There are 2 different groups going to the west. They don't appear to be have any depth to them at all, just rays coming out. They look like just changes in the color of the Mare. Okay, over to my right are the Beardy Mountains coming up. And we're just about over Messier and Pickering right now. Our first initial point is easily seen from our altitude. We're getting quite a bit of contrast as we approach the terminator. The view appears to be
Michael reports re-entry thruster instability, but was able to handle the excessive G-forces the Gemini spacecraft experienced plunging into the atmosphere. Scott, however, did black out momentarily as the craft reached almost 10 Gs, the craft struggling to remain in a heads-up attitude when needed. It was an intense, high-adrenaline end to a 2-week flight to the moon and back, one that ended up successful and memorable for all involved. Despite the thermal warnings and G-force loads, Gemini 5 splashes down in the South Pacific Ocean as the US Navy mounts its recovery of the 2 Kerbonauts. On September 2nd, 1963, Gemini 5 reached a low lunar orbit and returned to the Earth, safe and sound. That mission alone brought back almost 1.5 million funds and about 160 science. So, first up, we're going to drop a whole million funds on upgrading our build queue once again. This time we'll focus on the third and most efficient queue, as the lunar landing mission is going to be a test of our infrastructure rather than a one-off flight. For research, we are going to grab RTGs. Our interplanetary ventures will really benefit from them, and it's possible they could be flight ready by the time the next Earth-Mars transfer window opens in less than 2 years from now. As for contracts, we are going to fill our mission control with missions to Mars and Venus. They have a pretty lenient deadline and give us over 1 million more funds in advance money. This will give us a necessary boost to lunar landing infrastructure, as we put 60 more points into our build queue, as well as spending $300k to give us the final upgrade to mission control, since we appear to be running out of room to accept more contracts, and it is our only source of income after all. September 2nd, 1963. During the day, the crew of Gemini 5 have gone through medical examinations, press conferences, and flight debriefing, but as the afternoon turns to evening, Michael and Scott are reunited with their families who join mission control and bystanders for the second attempt at launching the Dinosaur spacecraft suborbitally. In February this year, the first flight test encountered a failed ignition of Chiton 2's second stage, and a terrifying brush with death Alan experienced falling that steeply through the atmosphere afterwards. Today, Neil is going to give it another go. Lifting from the surface, the first stage of Chiton 2 is emptied and detached, left to fall to the Gulf of Mexico just shy of the Florida coast. The upper stage, once fired, adjusts the vehicle's heading by 45 degrees northward, drifting Dyna's trajectory towards the eastern coast of the United States. Our target runway happens to be the Wallops Flight Facility, currently readying a small satellite to launch of their own. At precisely 4,600 kilometers per second orbital relative velocity, Chiton 2's upper stage shuts down, and shortly after, Dinosaur is released. Neil verifies his trajectory and has but a few moments to feel the effects of zero gravity. Reminiscent of the X-plane program that came before, this is the eye of the storm. What lies ahead is a dangerous plunge into the atmosphere, although this time Neil is equipped with a machine able to handle the heat and atmospheric abuse it is about to endure. Unlike the previous launch of Dyna, and unlike any mission flown before, Neil will pilot his craft in and out of the atmosphere several times, adjusting pitch and applying banking maneuvers to the best of his ability in order to end up on a trajectory that will allow him to touch down at the runway at Wallops, Virginia. The first dip into the atmosphere will reach heating levels equivalent to that expected from orbital re-entry, although Neil will experience close to 9 Gs for several moments during this time. This happens to be the most dangerous portion of the entire flight profile. During fully orbital missions, however, the G-forces experienced will be far less, due to the nature of its controlled shallow entry into the atmosphere. Suborbital flights, though, are the riskiest, but it serves to stress test the vehicle brilliantly. On the ground at Wallops, crew and bystanders aware of today's test hear the sonic booms as Dinosaur comes into view, a small dark delta wing in the evening sky, much like some sort of strange UFO sighting, I'm sure. An unintended side effect, now painfully evident to Neil in the cockpit, is that the effects of re-entry heating and the interaction of plasma and the resistant materials on the vehicle itself have caused a residue of sorts to build up on the front windows, meaning visibility has been greatly diminished. The windows to either side do not experience this, however, allowing the side windows to be used in tandem with instruments in the craft to bank, dip, and slow Dyna's trajectory as it approaches Wallops, even though visibility straight through the front of the vehicle is pretty much nulled. It becomes quickly evident, though, that maneuvers intended to avoid overshooting into the Atlantic Ocean were the slightest bit too excessive, and Neil realizes his airspeed will no longer allow a runway landing this flight. Instead, he'll have to touch the vehicle down just north of the flight facility, where enough flat ground will allow a safe landing. Wallops watches as Dinosaur, launched from Texas mere minutes ago, safely deploys its landing skids and touches down without incident. The mission is a success. Consequently, a small heat shield to cover the primary windows of the craft will be necessary on future flights, thanks to the testing done by Neil. But the Foundation has given the program the status of Go for orbital flights starting next year. September 7th, 1963. Speaking of Wallops, the final Catalyst C in Foundation use is ready to launch OSCS-4, an Agena-attached short-duration communications test platform meant to further study ground and orbital-based networking. Catalyst D will be replacing the C variant next month without much visual change, simply slightly upgraded engines and improved performance. The team at Wallops take time from their busy schedule inspecting and restoring the new Dinosaur arrival to watch the midday liftoff. Soars southeastward across the Atlantic Ocean, a problem-free liftoff. The targeted trajectory is a suborbital altitude with an apogee of 850 kilometers, and this is reached perfectly. The Agena is detached and waits for several minutes for its orbital insertion burn, which will take just over 3 minutes. If all goes well, OSCS will be placed into a 6,300 kilometers by 850 kilometer orbit, as desired by our paying customer. Orbital parameters met, the Foundation's role is complete. Wallops proves its capability by performing a flawless flight today. Mission success. The Mission Control Building finished its final upgrade, allowing us to accept practically unlimited contracts. So, naturally, we'll grab the last few we already planned to complete at Mars, as well as the single crewed lunar orbit contract. We intend on flying a full-stack Cateran 5 Trinity to lunar orbit before the landing, and we may not meet this specific deadline. However, I am willing to eat the penalty for declining and reaccepting for that $500,000 funds advance. October 16th, 1963. Back in Brownsville, we are once again treated to the sight of 2 simultaneously launch-ready rockets, this time in the form of Catalyst D Kentars, a new variant of Catalyst capable of more than Cablestar, Agena, or Vega are capable of. tonight's flight will see the launch of Loros B, an uprated Loros relay satellite destined for lunar orbit. 24 hours later, the second Catalyst will lift off with Surveyor 1, a small spacecraft destined for the lunar surface. Very early in the morning, Loros B is away. Soaring into the sunrise just before Miko, Kentaur lights its engines for the final leg into orbit. Roughly 11 minutes from liftoff, Loros is in a 236 by 230 kilometer orbit, and Flight Control planned the injection burn. This will occur in 15 minutes time, plotting a direct trajectory that will take roughly 6 days to reach the moon. This approach, although taking 3 days longer than normally desired TLI burns, is more fuel efficient, saving a little bit of fuel for lunar insertion, although this is not entirely necessary for this particular flight, as it will more so come into play with Surveyor's launch tomorrow morning. Burn complete, a 500 kilometer paraloon plotted, solar panels are deployed to keep Loros powered, and in 6 days from now, our relay satellite will be in place above the moon. Back on the ground, the second Catalyst D Kentaur has been patient. As Loros coasts away from the Earth, the launch team rested and recuperated. Another dark and early morning liftoff occurs. Surveyor 1 is on its way. And 44 seconds into the flight, Booster 2, the starboard booster engine, explodes along with half of the skirt attached to the bottom of Catalyst. This happens mere moments before nominal skirt separation was meant to occur, which, luckily, despite the near catastrophe, does separate nominally. Carefully monitoring telemetry, it seems the Catalyst missile is unfazed by the anomaly, at least for now. Kentaur lights its twin engines just as the sun peaks above its relative horizon. Just a few more minutes to orbit, but all is looking well. Orbit achieved. Ground control plots another TLI as we get our first look at the Surveyor lander in orbit. There are some key differences between it and its real-life counterpart, but we'll talk more about them later on. For now, with one part of the mission on its way to the moon, it's time for Surveyor to also make its way. TLI complete, Surveyor will end up reaching the moon in 3.5 days' time, 1.5 days before Loros is scheduled to arrive as well. This gives Loros optimal time to adjust its trajectory to align its line of sight with Surveyor and the Earth in time for Surveyor's attempted landing. As the Earth gets smaller, both spacecraft coast towards lunar space. Three and a half days from liftoff, Kentaur blasts through the last little bit of its residual fuel, and then lets go of Surveyor. Here's where we can talk more about the differences between this lander and the real thing. Firstly, and most relevant, would be its retro pack. The real Surveyor has a solid motor retro pack. The lander frame sort of wraps around, and the lander itself approached the moon in a direct descent fashion, not entering lunar orbit first. The retro pack and its 3 vernier engines fired at once and slowed down with the force of close to 8 Gs or so, jettisoning the retro pack and still using the 3 small verniers to finally touch down. Well, we don't have that retro rocket in the game, so instead, I've created a liquid fuel retro rocket. Since it takes roughly 5 minutes to burn through its fuel, we can't recreate the IRL landing trajectory. However, this does allow us to start and restart the retro rocket multiple times, meaning we can burn to orbit and land later, allowing us to complete a lunar far side landing. 2 burns later, and we are in a 40-kilometer circular lunar orbit. Now all we've got to do is wait for Loros B to arrive overhead. Speaking of, let's head back to Loros now. Approaching lunar space, Kentaur lights its engines one final time to bring the relay satellite into its parking orbit. From there, it will be released with power and fuel of its own to alter its orbit, providing a communications relay as needed for future lunar missions. Due to miscalculations by flight control, totally not me just forgetting which way the sun travels across the lunar surface, Surveyor and Loros are currently orbiting the moon in the exact opposite lunar phase than desired. This means the entire far side of the surface is currently in shadow. Although we could land in the dark, those back home would really like to actually see something from the lander's onboard television camera, so we will wait in these parking orbits for the right time to land. Both craft have solar panels to keep them alive for quite a while, so we won't need to worry about losing a week or so of time. 18 days from liftoff, 12 days in lunar orbit, Loros performs a series of maneuvers that will place it in the optimal position for Surveyor 1's landing. Its final orbit of 2,000 kilometers is inclined by 50.8 degrees, allowing, for the time being, and once more every lunar cycle, 0 communication blackouts for the spacecraft on the far side of the moon. If it has line of sight with anything on the surface there, it will provide connection all the way back to Earth. This very orbit will be the Surveyor's last, one way or another. Approaching direct loss of signal with Earth along the lunar terminator, connection routed through Loros B is verified. We have comms. With the inclination just right and Loros poised in an optimal position, we have the entire far side to land on. Without an exact landing point in mind, simply somewhere sort of flat, preferably not on top of any rocks, as the science team puts it, Surveyor 1's telemetry is checked out, and it is given the green light. We are go for far side landing. The burn will take roughly 10 minutes to complete, starting with burning through the rest of the attached retro rocket, and then using its 3 verniers to soft land on the moon. Normally, the verniers would light along with the retro rocket to provide attitude control, and small thrusters would provide additional attitude control later on. However, something else that's different about our Surveyor is the addition of a small reaction wheel centered on the vehicle. We can adjust and maintain desired attitude at will without changing our trajectory or requiring additional sources of fuel. Relatively lightweight as well, to be honest. And this is the first we have ever used this reaction wheel, but I imagine it will see more use in deep space probes as well. as even the tiniest of thrusts can drastically change the trajectory at times. But enough getting away from the mission at hand. The retro rocket is jettisoned after 3 minutes and 40 seconds of sustained burn, and now it's all up to the remaining 3 engines to get us down safely.
425 feet per second, speed 24,000 feet. Engineering commutator 3 has been turned on. We are responsive to the engineering 3 data. Strain gauges are reading out. These strain gauges will give us indication about touchdown. 400 feet per second. Speed 12,000 feet. 10,000 feet. All signals are normal. 8,000 feet. 250 feet per second. 8,000 feet. 200 feet per second. Service reported in excellent condition. All signals look good. 4,000 feet. Safe.
Back down on Earth, the mission control room erupts in applause and cheers as the monitored decreasing numbers from telemetry suggest Surveyor has successfully touched down on the surface. Nominal descent. 2 world firsts completed in a single mission, both the first landing on the far side of the moon and the first soft landing performed with throttleable engines. The success today provides the Foundation with valuable experience regarding the in-development crewed landing missions to come, as they will take a very similar approach to landing on the surface. Throttleable engines are a must for the safety of our future lunar explorers. Now, for the portion of Loros' orbit where communications with Surveyor can take place, various experiments are carried out regarding the surface of the moon, and what mysteries the side which never faces the Earth may be hiding just underneath the dust. Another Surveyor mission to the far side is planned, as well as others to other locations on the moon as well. But for now, as various data slowly makes its way back to ground control, the mission is a resounding success. We do have one more mission coming up in December, but we're going to end the episode here in November to both stay right alongside our competitor Beardy, as well as to save me just a few hours of late night editing, and many more hours of mission planning since we don't want our build queue to be empty ever. Gotta plan ahead now, something well, we'll see how it goes. As you can pretty obviously tell though, both of us have kitted out our space centers with Kerbal constructs, which I'm honestly really excited about. Now we'll be launching from real space centers, it feels like, as well as multi-launch shenanigans, which I absolutely cannot get enough of. But as always, if you'd like to see what the Soviets have been up to, there's a link in the description to Beardy's video. And until next time, thank you all so much for watching, and peace out.